here is,
You see the bees?
here are the bees on the outside of the, what we call the inner cover. Okay. And almost all of these bees are females. There are 3 different kinds of bees in a hive. There's the worker bees, which are females. That's the largest number. There's the male bees, which are the drones. There probably are some here, but there aren't going to be many at this time of year. And then there's one queen, and she is a female, but she's also the mother of all the other bees in the hive. A healthy hive can have 50 or 60,000 bees in it. The question was, do we need to get a new queen bee every year? And the answer is hopefully not. They live 3 to 5 years. And the goal of a beekeeper, among other things, is to successfully help the bees overwinter, which means to make it through the winter into the next spring. And in fact, if you're a new beekeeper or you're starting with a new hive, you will not get any honey until the first summer after the year that you got your bees. So if I got new bees last year, like I did in 2018, I knew right away I wasn't going to have honey in 2018 because it takes an entire year for them to produce it. And if they die in the winter of 2018, I have to start over again. So that part gets kind of frustrating. Now this is a frame grabber. This is my own personal thing that I brought along, and I'm totally addicted to them. It helps me pull out a frame without having to fumble with the edges of the frame. And once again, I think it allows me to do things a little more gently. Okay? And really, I'm pretty conservative. I could be doing this without gloves. I could probably get away with shorts. And the reason is they're not aggressive animals. They're not really interested in stinging a person. They will only do it to defend either their queen or their babies. That's the only reason they're going to sting you, if they think those are in danger. What you see here, I'll show you guys over here and then I'll walk around with it. What you see here is a lot of bees on a frame of what we call drawn comb, which is the hexagonal things are called the comb, and that is made of wax, and they've made it all themselves. They did this themselves. So bees, obviously it takes energy to produce wax, and what they want to do is have the most possible storage space for the least amount of work, and that turns out to be a hexagon. They could have done a square, they could do a triangle, anything else that would fit together nicely, but the hexagon is the best. So this dark brown stuff that's on top of the comb in this particular frame is called brood. And this is a mixture of wax and other chemicals that the bees have in their bodies that covers the brood nest, which is basically a little nursery for the larva when it's in here.
How often do you take the honey out of the hive?
Okay, the question was how often do we harvest the honey, and the answer is it depends. Okay, usually it's once a year in around basically June or July. That's the main harvest. That's right after the nectar flow ends and the bees have put in the maximum amount of nectar into the hive, and they've also fanned it down to turn it into what we recognize as honey. So that's the sweet spot, no pun intended, where we have the most amount of honey, and a beekeeper will come in and take out a certain amount and leave some for the bees. Sometimes in a really good year, and this is actually one of them for some of the beekeepers, they'll have really a bumper crop, which is a fall harvest, because there's so much flow and there's so much rain and so much growth that there's a chance to actually have a second harvest. I didn't have that luck this year, but some people I think did. But you'll never be more than 2 times a year, I would say. Now, I think I'm probably going to close this up because I want to be a good neighbor and not kind of irritate the bees too much. And also, it's kind of a hot day. But this is how a beekeeper functions, and this is how, if I were in my actual hives, I'd be looking for the queen. I'd be looking for signs of her if I don't find her. And the best sign is to see eggs and little larvae. That means that she's alive and doing well. And I'd be looking for that kind of stuff. I'd be looking for evidence of pests or disease. And obviously I'd be looking to see how their food stores are right now, because going into the winter, that's my main job, to make sure they have food. So, well, the question was, what do you do if they don't have enough food? And the contract we have with bees is the beekeeper takes some honey, but in return for that, the beekeeper has to get the bees through the winter. And what we do is we feed them a sugar syrup, which I was talking about earlier. It can come like this in a bucket, and you make your own, you mix it up. 1-to-1 sugar to water in the summer and fall, and then when we get into the winter, we make it more sugar content, 2-to-1. It gets kind of expensive. I spend about $22 a week on sugar.
Oh, wow.
And I actually had a lady at the grocery store. I always go to the same store. She's like, "Are you into baking?" Or I always see you, you know. And I said, "Well, how much honesty do you want?" She said, "Well, I'd like to know what you do with that." I said, "Well, I feed it to my bees." So that was an interesting day talking to her about that. And this is a wonderful question too. He was asking kind of, how do you keep bees warm in the winter? And the answer is you don't need to. Listen, folks, it's kind of amazing, but bees have been placed into freezers just for testing. They've also been, they've also survived in northern Minnesota in 20 and 30 degrees below zero. And you ask, how do they do it? The answer is they cluster. They form a big grapefruit-sized ball around the queen, and they take turns moving from the outside to the inside of it. The ones outside, of course, get cold, and they all flap their wings all winter long to keep the cluster warm. Now, isn't that incredible? And they can keep it at 92 degrees Fahrenheit, even in the dead of winter.
That's amazing.
So I used to think this too, like my bees are going to freeze to death, but in fact, when they die, it's usually not due to the cold. It's usually due to something else, starvation or more commonly disease.
If they're starving, do you have any indicators that they're hungry on their way to starving, or is it a quick boom?
Well, no. If you're diligent, you can see whether or not they. Certainly, obviously, you have to provide the food. You do it with the sugar water, and then actually we give them cake icing, which is called fondant in the winter. It's just a solid thing that you stick on top of the hive inside right here, and they come up and eat it. It's like cake icing. What I'm doing now, not very effectively, is trying to blow some air on them to get them to get away from the edge, because I'm about to put the lid back on. In Montgomery County, we have an extremely good relationship with the county, and you do not need a permit. They do ask that you register your bees, but that's mainly so the Department of Agriculture can keep track of bee diseases and trends and stuff. And it's voluntary. I always do, because I just think the certificate is really fun to have. But you do not actually need to have a permit, and you can have them in your backyard. You can. I know people who have them on balconies of apartments. There's a guy in our club who has them on the roof of his office building, and is actually very successful. So it's
and
pretty.
And there's no limit to how many they allow you to have on your property?
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I mean, I imagine there'd be a limit, but I have 2. You know, maybe my neighbor has 10 or 11. It depends on the size of your yard. We always say, sort of jokingly, the real problem is with the neighbors. You know, you don't want to obviously create a problem.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What happens if you have it and you have neighbors who are complaining, or for instance, have have a sensitivity?
Well, I mean, there could be, first of all, legally it's not clear like who would win that, but obviously to be a good neighbor, if somebody does complain, you'd want to accommodate that. What we like to say is the very first time your neighbors should know that you're a beekeeper is when you show up with a free bottle of honey. Yep. And that kind of solves the diplomacy problem. So I do this anyway, but all my neighbors get a bottle of honey.
Can you keep, does it make any difference if you have a dog or a cat? Can you keep those while you have bees in your house?
I have dogs, and I have tenants who, I have a neighbor who has a cat, and we've got dogs, and nobody seems to care. I mean, I don't think, they don't really even notice it. And once again, bees are actually very docile animals. Technically, they're vegetarians. They eat plant-based products, so they're not really interested in stinging you just for the fun of it or for a meal or anything. They sting in order to protect their colony, to protect their queen or their babies, and they die in the process of stinging you too. So they only get one sting. If somebody tells me I got stung by a bee, usually I ask them what did the bee look like, and more often than not what you're talking about is a yellow jacket.
Yeah.
The yellow jackets are carnivores and they have stingers that can sting multiple times. They use their stinger as a weapon, as a sword, not as a shield. So there's some very important differences. Well, the question was about die-off, and there's been a lot of issues, but the one that's made the news most is something called colony collapse disorder, which is a mysterious thing where bees leave. They leave a perfectly healthy colony and they never come back, and they don't move into another one. They just kind of abandon their queen and disappear. And that has typically plagued commercial beekeepers more than people like myself, backyard beekeepers. And the thought is, although I don't, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he's the son of a guy these guys have been beekeeping for like 200 years. So, I think he's checking to make sure I'm right.
You're fine, tell me.
Colony collapse disorder. I think it affects commercial beekeepers, and we haven't seen it recently anyway. The other sad reality is, when you're working with bees, some will die, and I had to kind of reconcile myself to that. They die. They live 6 weeks normally, but also in the process of working with them, you're going to end up squashing some, and that's regrettable. But it's really kind of unavoidable, especially in this situation. That's another wonderful question. The question was, swarming, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And that's a terrific thing. Swarming is the colony's equivalent to procreation. Okay, if you think about a bee being born as an individual, a new colony being born, that's what happens when swarming occurs. Swarming tells you that the colony was very successful. They were so successful that they got too big for their current home. And so a part of them, usually about 2/3 of them, left, and they leave a third of them. They leave with the existing queen, and about 1/3 of them stay, and they create a new queen is what happens. So a colony splits into two. That's what happens for swarming.
So if they swarm, if you had an empty hive set up nearby, would they go to that?
It could happen. It's pretty unlikely. The idea that they would just randomly leave their home and fly into your empty colony, I've never heard of that.
Okay.
So, that's pretty tricky.